What's going on, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. And also, I just learned a Bay Area relative. Everyone say hello to Ping Chen. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad, but you're not in the East Bay right now. You're a little farther away than that.
That's all right. I'm in Philly.
Now, how long you been in Philadelphia for?
Oh gosh, about 2 years now.
You like it?
I love it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I really do. I was super sad to leave the Bay Area, of course, and I always wanted to move back, but it is, spoiler alert, not particularly affordable.
Well, it's getting there. I mean, if you pay attention to what's going on now, I feel like that's all people want to talk about. It's just the rent price is going down. But
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I moved here 2011 from Jersey.
Okay.
And it was expensive when I moved here. So it's been, almost 10 years, but it's kind of what it is. So I guess we'll get to eventually what brought you to Philadelphia. Not everyone moves to Philadelphia. I'm sure there's a reason why you started there. But let's go back. We were saying before, you were born in Berkeley, raised in Oakland. What kind of got you into writing? Were you an avid reader as a kid? Did you always want to be a Wall Street Journal correspondent? What's the intro to you?
Sure. Since you know the Bay Area, I grew up going pretty religiously to the Berkeley Public Library. So favorite was always the Claremont branch. We called it the Friendly Library because that was where the librarians were super nice and just were like presided over my childhood. And yeah, I was a huge reader growing up and loved books, and just books were my refuge. I was a pretty awkward kid and just always loved words, loved books, and never thought that writing was going to be a profession, or at least writing fiction. So I love to write poetry and I love to write fiction, and I spent a lot of time doing both those things all through school and through college, but it was just, it really did not seem like something one could do or expect to do full time. And so I started doing journalism in college and found I loved that too. It was just a way of exercising curiosity. My first job was working for an alt weekly in Providence, and I got to write about cops. I got to write about prisons.
Providence, Rhode Island?
Providence, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm.
You're writing about the police department in Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh man, yeah.
And arguably one of the most corrupt cities in America.
Yes, exactly. It was really interesting. And
I'm obsessed with the mafia. And for anyone who doesn't know, Providence, Rhode Island, the patriarchal crime family. Providence is a pretty heady place. It's a beautiful city. Interesting that you started your journalism career there. I'm sorry, continue.
I really love that. It was just, I found it's a way just to meet so many people, right? And I'm one of those people that if you meet me at a party, I'm probably going to try and corner you and just ask you a million questions about what you do.
What would you ask me if you saw me in a party?
I would just, I started by asking you about your posters and your T-shirt.
Pretty self-explanatory.
Just the whole spiel. And what's it like to have a podcast? I think I'm one of those people who just finds kind of no matter who you are or what you do, I find you really interesting and have a million questions. And so journalism was a really good avenue in that respect. And so I graduated college. I started working eventually for the Wall Street Journal.
How does that happen? You say that pretty nonchalantly, and you don't have to go into super detail.
Sure.
How does one begin a career at the Wall Street Journal? And also, why the Wall Street Journal? Again, a pretty, they do their thing.
Yes,
why
they do.
them?
Yeah,
why them?
Sure. Politically, they have a certain, obviously, reputation. The newsroom is very separate and firewalled from the editorial side. So in case your listeners aren't already very clear on that. But yeah, I feel like I just, they were hiring and they were nice enough to hire me. I had been living in China for some time. So I'll tell you like the more detailed kind of chronology of getting there was I spent some time working in DC. I was working for The Nation magazine, which is, was a place that I love to work too. But I didn't love DC. I felt like DC was a place that was just a gorgeous city. And it sort of felt like I should be 50 years old and retired. I don't know, like it felt so comfortable and kind of edgeless, at least where I was reporting on the Hill and that sort of thing.
You're being very nice.
And I wanted to go back. Sorry?
I said you're being very nice, but you are correct. Yeah.
And I wanted to go back to China, which is where I'd spent some time when I was at university studying abroad, and just wanted to be sort of thrown back into that world and be challenged more, and just like that sense of friction and fascination. It's such an incredibly rich place to live, which is of course also why I wrote the book. Um, yeah, so I went back to China and I spent a year there on a fellowship. And after that
Where
was
in China
through,
specifically?
sorry.
Where in China?
Oh, I was in Chengdu.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which
and my ex girlfriend's from there.
oh no
Yeah,
way.
I've been there, but I've also been to Hong Kong.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
think you
Oh,
spent some time in
fantastic.
Hong Kong. Yeah, we'll talk about it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing. Yes, I love Chengdu, and I love my time there. And I actually spent I was on a fellowship, but I spent a lot of that time not really doing research and writing fiction instead. And it was only when the
I
year was
had the
over.
opposite, but yeah, okay.
Oh,
Continue.
yeah. And when that year was over, I was like, well, I have to get a job.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
then I got a job, and I think it helped that I had language skills. I don't think I could have gotten a job at the Wall Street Journal in the US. I just didn't have I didn't have any proper newspaper experience or anything. So
hmm
yeah, I'm really grateful that the paper hired me out there. And I spent a couple years in Hong Kong, which is a city, I'm sure if you've been, it's just such an extraordinary place. It's a
hmm
city I love being a reporter in. And then after that, I was in Beijing, moved there in 2014. I was there for 4 years before coming back.
Oh,
So all told, if you add it up, I spent more time living in China, in Beijing, actually, than anywhere except for Oakland. So
wow.
it was like,
Okay. So I mean, so it seems like the universe was kind of putting you in a not a bubble, but on a path. You're in China. You're writing about China, correct? This is
that's
your
right.
journalistic. How did you feel about that? I mean, writing about a country that you grew up in America. You grew up in the East Bay. A lot different than Chengdu, China. How was that just as a journalist, living there, writing about? What was that experience like?
So I'll tell you, when I first went to China, this was back in 2006. So it was pre-Olympics, and I was still a student, and I just was miserable. It was a place that I was always really curious to go, but I found I had a really hard time there. It was Again, it was before the Olympics, and so much in the city was getting torn down.
Mm-hmm.
I had grown up in a family that just had really sort of steeped in a deep appreciation of like all the what it meant to be Chinese and Chinese pottery and scrolls hanging on our walls and just all these stories, right, of my grandparents. And then to go to the country and look around and just see so much of that being destroyed or having long since been lost. Really, when I first arrived in the country, I just felt the sense of dislocation. It was like arriving like on Mars, like it was like nothing I recognized. And having come back to the place as a reporter, I found was actually really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It just allowed me to not have that sort of really emotional, visceral reaction and
That you had
that
previous.
I had previously. Exactly. Yeah. And so I really love that. It just like I got to travel the country all over and just meet all kinds of people, whether it was striving college students or elderly farmers. A lot of the folk that you'll meet in this book. Yeah, and so I mean I it's a hard place to be a journalist, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and it's gotten much harder. But it's a country that I love, and
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love being a reporter there. I miss it.
So you're in China. You're working. You said you're corresponding for the Wall Street Journal there. When's fiction coming into your mind? I mean, were you ever writing fiction as a kid, in college? I mean, were you ever creating stories in your mind? Again, reporting for the Wall Street Journal is a little different than writing fiction, but also having read your work, you write with in a fictitious way. So kind of what was that blend like? How did that kind of happen?
I've always written fiction and poetry on the side, and it was something that um, when I first started working with the journal. So when I got that job, I had just finished that year in Chengdu, where, as I mentioned, I did spend a fair bit of time writing fiction, and I wrote a novel, and I was trying when I joined the paper, I was trying still to revise it, and it wasn't really going anywhere, and I ended up eventually setting it aside, and one day I was just biking home and this phrase Shanghai Murmur popped into my head, and it's one of the stories in the collection, and it's coming out shortly in the Atlantic as well. And I had never written short stories before, and I had always of course loved the genre, but yeah, so I just sort of sat down and decided I want to try and write 10, and those became the book. And for me, I feel like fiction, as a reporter, you meet so many people and you see so much, and in my case, like you've got notebooks full of details and observations and bits that are never going to become part of a proper news story. And China is such a place where, right, like there's obviously you could write you could fill a whole newspaper every day with stories about China. But even so, like I would come home from my day job and still want to write and still want to try and conjure up and capture some of what I was seeing around me, a lot of which just, doesn't really fit in the context of proper news, the regular news. And so for me, fiction was, in terms of how it coexisted with the journalism, it was another way of capturing what I saw around me, right? And it was also, there was something really liberating about the process of writing these stories too. The Wall Street Journal, of course, is a place where you're heavily edited, where you're constantly thinking about your editor, your audience.
Are you? I don't work there. You tell me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For sure. Of course. Yeah.
Uh-huh. I keep picturing that television show. Was it Newsroom, right, on HBO?
Oh,
Jeff
yeah.
Daniels, right?
I've not seen it.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Well, it's more about the anchor side. I guess it has nothing to do with newspaper reporting now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, okay. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. So it's, you write a story and every word is scrutinized, right? And a lot of them will get cut and a lot of them will get rewritten.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard place, to sometimes feel like you have that kind of terrain to run in.
For sure.
And so to get to sit down in the mornings and just write.
Do you write in the morning?
Mostly in the morning. Yeah, exactly. I would do some revision at night.
But real quick, I want to go back to what you said a little earlier. Yeah. You said you wrote a book.
Yes.
What happened to that book?
Oh, it's like in a defunct hard drive.
Man, it's blowing my mind. I mean, I've recorded 30 of these episodes. I think almost every single author I've talked to has said the same thing. Their first book, it's like fucking see you later. I wrote a book when I was like 21. I'm 33 now. Okay.
What was it? Yeah.
Well, at the time, the reason I even started writing was I was quitting smoking cigarettes, and this is over 10 years ago. And this was how I did it. I would try to write this book, and it was awful. It was about some like 20-year-old kid who wins like $60 million in the lottery. It was a piece of shit. It was awful.
I mean, I want to know what happens.
Well, what happened was I had the title of the book. I liked it so much. Now it's the name of the novel I'm about to finish right now.
Oh, congratulations.
So I was able to keep the title of the book. That's got to be 7 Mac computers ago. You know what I mean? That thing is so far gone. But it's cool to hear. Again, almost every author I've talked to has said the exact same thing. Like they've thrown it in a volcano. They, because the people who are listening to this, a lot of people, might be working on their first book, or their third book, or their whatever. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that and make sure that people heard that, your first book is somewhere.
Yeah. And that's so much of what comes out of writing one, right? As you know, it's just like, well, the feeling of like, well, I did that. I can do that.
Exactly.
Right? Like
that's what it was. Yeah. And I had the same feeling with music all along. It was always, I started playing guitar when I was 10. And to me, it was always like, well, if, Eric Clapton can do it, why can't I play the guitar too? That was always the kind of thing. Okay. So you have these ideas for these short stories, you said you had the number 10. Why? Because it's a nice even number. Are most short story collections 10 stories?
I think they really range.
Yeah. Okay. So you have this number 10, when did you kind of really start getting serious about it? When did you think, all right, well, this is something I want to start dedicating even more of my time to?
I think from the very start. And it surprised me because it came so readily. And I think for me, it was just the experience of having lived in China for so long and having spent so much time accumulating just thoughts, observations, stray images, and not having any place to channel them, right? As soon as I sat down and start writing, like it just like that feeling of that urgency of having the chance and like the space to get these down was just super fun and exciting. And from the start.
And you said you write in the mornings. I mean, have you always been, I'd imagine, again, I don't work at the Wall Street Journal, but I'd imagine you have to have a sense of discipline and you have to, you're working on deadlines. I mean, do you bring that same approach to your fiction writing? Are you very like, I work from this time to this time, and what's your routine like?
I'm not. I wish I were. I should be. I'll say one thing is the piece of writing advice that I have found not particularly helpful is that admonishment that you need to write for X period of time a day and make it your job. Okay, I'm sorry. I find it helpful in as much as it sort of urges you and kicks you to keep going, right?
Yeah.
But just as somebody who's had complicated family situations at time and like caregiving responsibilities, and most recently had a child. Like some of these aspirations are just not realistic. And so there are definitely, I'd say I write more in bursts. There are periods when I'm working really intensely, like I did with these short stories. And then there will be months that go by when I'm not working on anything.
Entire months where you won't write any fiction at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Really?
And I just have other life stuff happening.
Well, understandable. Do you find that when you do come back to writing fiction, comedians talk about it a lot, musicians talk about it all the time, being rusty, right? A lot of my friends who are playing in bands, touring in bands, they're not going to have stepped on a stage in 2 years, maybe by the time they get on stage again. They're going to have to work off that rust. I mean, but people couldn't see when you were saying people who write every day like a whack job. I was pointing at myself because I'm a whack job. That's how I am able to like sleep at night. I know I did that work. I own a small business here in the city, so I have pockets of time where I can get that work in, and it means a lot to me. But the idea for me, the idea of not writing for 3 months, it's like, well, at that point, can I even read anymore? Do you have that? Obviously, you're laughing, you're smiling. I'm assuming. Do you deal with any of that kind of, in the times that you're not?
It hadn't occurred to me. I feel like I would have needed to already feel like I'd gotten to a certain level of proficiency and comfort and mastery to even. Whereas I feel like when I step away and come back, whether I'm stepping away for the day because I've got to go to work or I've set it something aside for 3 months, each time I feel like I come back in and I'm like, oh gosh, how do I do this?
Every
right?
time,
Like I
right?
I don't think I ever really get that sense of confidence that I'm like, I got it now. I know how to do this. Each time you sit down,
Are you working with, or is any of that kind of going on in your head when you're doing the actual work? Are you, do you deal with doubt at times? Are you the kind of person when you sit at the laptop, you're like, how the fuck did I,
yeah.
who am I? Like, or are you kind of just, again, you're coming from the journalism world where, that's your job. And I'm assuming it's a different kind of, again, I imagine a much more militaristic way you approach writing, only because that's how I'm interpreting it in my head. But
Yeah. I think I approach sometimes I can tell you the writing it's almost I don't know how to put it exactly. So I write a lot in the morning, right? And so you wake up and you're almost half in that just groggy dream state and you start writing. And so I think for me, the kicking oneself comes later in the, like, oh God, what are you doing? That's usually like when I've woken up a bit and maybe I'm like 20 minutes in, and then I start reading back and I'm like, wow, this is terrible. And but you keep going. And I do think journalism is helpful in that way. And like we were saying before, having written a novel that wasn't very good is also helpful in that way because you can get to the other side of these words, right? And then the other thing that journalism teaches you really well is that you can always make them better.
That's an interesting thing you say. You got to the other side of these words, right? It's like you did it.
Yeah.
And it's hard to look back when you finish something and think about all the work you put into it when it's like there in front of you. But getting that I'm going to use that, and now in my head, just getting on the other side of those words. It's not like a hill that you have to kind of go up, but most authors I speak with, they don't necessarily get the joy in the actual writing. It's hard to, when you're in the trenches, to see that.
Yeah.
But when you're on the other side of those words, even at the end of your day,
right,
back on that work that was done. But you had said though, when you get like 15 or 20 minutes in, you're like, what the hell is this? Are you editing along the way? Are you a draft person? I mean, what's your process like?
I do edit along the way.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of inevitable given that reflex is just so honed in me from years of working in journalism. So yeah, I do edit along the way. But I do spend also a fair amount of time just writing and seeing where things will go. And so for me, what I loved about short stories in particular was the sense that they could go anywhere, right? Like you can sit down at the keyboard and throw in a color or a character or just an image, and it takes the story in a whole new direction, different from novels in that way. I think when something you really feel like you're anchoring yourself much more and committing, like more like poetry. I mean, short stories have that sense of serendipity to them, I found, at least in the writing process. And so for me, it was I would say a lighter, easier experience than writing a novel. when you're talking, talking about like that sense of being in the trenches. For me, writing short stories was just like a feeling of play, a feeling of joy,
Yeah, I feel the
versus
same.
writing the novel, which was much more,
Most definitely. Yeah, I mean,
that thing was hard.
you know about as much as me than I know of you. And I wrote a novella. I self-published it in February, and then 3 weeks later, the world shut down.
Oh wow.
So when that happened, I'm like, all right, well, I've been working on a novel for years, but I started myself writing short stories. I never done it before.
Oh,
Um,
fantastic.
it's funny that we're talking because you had a short story. What was the name of the story that you had that published by the New Yorker?
Lulu.
So I received my second rejection from the New Yorker this morning via email. And it's funny because, you know, Janet Fitch asked me, we were doing a podcast, and she was like, well, are you submitting it to other places too? And I'm like, no. I'm like, I'm shooting for the stars. I'm like, why not go for the absolute top and then, let the shit kind of come tumble down? What was the process? How did you get involved with the New Yorker? I mean, it's one of the, it's some people's dream to have their stuff published in the New Yorker. I do it kind of as a gag. I'd be amazed if they published me. What was your process like? I mean, when did you get that call? I mean,
Yeah. I had written the short stories, and then I went out and tried to get an agent. And I once an agent took the project on, she was going to submit it to publishers, and she said to me, and that was all sort of like we're planning. It was like all signs of go. We're gonna try and sell it. And then she came back to me. She said, "You know what? We need to try and get some of these stories published first." And my heart just sank because
really? Yeah.
yeah, well, because I hadn't, when I was writing these short stories, and in general, when it came to fiction, I didn't talk about it to anyone except for my husband,
Yeah.
while I was writing these short stories. And so eventually, I had one friend read it in Beijing, but then apart from him and my husband, like the first person to read it was my agent. And so it was just like the sense of terror, like, oh God, it just made it real all of a sudden, and it became. And I sort of melted down a little bit on the phone, but she was like, it's okay, I'm just gonna, like, we have to try some of these literary sites, and like then they'll know you're a literary person and they'll take you seriously. That was sort of the crux of it, right? And so I said, okay, fine. This was last year around this time, I want to say. Oh no, I'm sorry, the year before that.
I don't
And
even know what planet we're on at this
I
point.
know, oh my gosh. So she went ahead and she submitted it to the New Yorker, and I guess other publications, I'm not quite sure. And then I got an email saying that I think the subject line was like huge news, exclamation. And I read it, and I felt the same terror, I'll be honest, thinking like, oh God, now this is going to get published. But also just then I started crying because it was
Uh-huh.
just, to just feel like, oh gosh, wow, someone read it and thought it was good enough. That's amazing.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you're smiling, you're full of joy. A lot of authors, when when they get to this part of the story, it's not so joyful. A lot of rejection comes along the way. But you'd said how in the beginning, before it got sold, your agent wanted to have some stories published, and you said at the time that made you, you were heartbroken. Looking back on that now, obviously, are you happy it happened that way?
Yeah, I'm happy it happened that way. And maybe the fact that I sat on things so long was helpful, because if I don't think I would have had the stomach for rejections. I already, it sort of felt like me writing was in this imaginary space that no one really knew about, and it was, and that was partly what enabled it to keep going, was just like this feeling that it wasn't subject to anyone's scrutiny, right?
Yeah.
That it was, but yeah, no, I'm enormously grateful that it happened.
And
God,
that
like I
story
guess
is going to be included in the book that's coming
it
out.
will. Yeah,
And
that's
can you
right.
let people know, please, what the name of that book is?
Yes, the book is called Land of Big Numbers, and it's out on February 2nd.
Mhm.
And yes, um, I'm excited.
Are you
Nervous.
working on anything new? What happens to you now that that first book is out? Are you going to attempt any long form fiction? Do you want to stick with short
Yeah,
stories?
I have
Do
a
you want to go
novel that
back
I'm
to
working on.
China?
I couldn't go back to China now if
Yeah.
I tried, unfortunately. But yes, I am working on a novel. And for the time being, I'm here in Philly. I've got some projects going on, but I think like everyone, it's the pandemic, and my house is much fuller now. My parents are with me. I've got a very mobile toddler constantly running around. So
Uh,
yeah, it's harder.
All right. Well, Deping, this has been a blast. I always have a couple of quick questions at the end of this. I know you're living in Philly now, but can you give a shout out to some of your favorite bookstores in the country that have kind of helped you along the way, or that you
Oh my gosh.
want people to buy your book from?
I mean, I grew up going to Moe's. Um, and yeah, for me, that was my first introduction to kind of independent bookstores. And I just remember feeling like going there as a teenager and realizing this whole universe of independent bookstores exist. Like growing up, when I was young, we would go to, Borders, Barnes and Noble, that sort of thing. And so for me, going to a place like Moe's was just revelatory.
This is Moe's in Santa Cruz,
I'm sorry,
or
Moe's in Berkeley.
Berkeley? Okay, yeah, most
Yeah,
definitely, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of the bookstores that I grew up going to unfortunately have shuttered
Mm.
and or changed hands, like Cody's or some of the places that I mourn. Um,
Any Philly bookstores? I can't think of any Philly bookstores.
Harriet's Bookshop is wonderful,
Cool.
and highly encourage folks to check it out in when things get better.
Yeah.
A good place for books, Books Inc.
Cool.
Yeah, so many favorites.
And
And
are you a social media person? Can people connect with you anyway?
I hate thinking of myself as a social media person,
I
but yes,
mean, are you on social
I
media,
am on
or
social
are you a
media.
person?
Yes, and I am a person. So yes, said person can be found at TEPINGCHEN on Twitter. That's the only one I
Awesome.
have.
Deping, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, most
It's so
definitely.
fun.
Bundle up. It's about to get a little colder in Philadelphia.
Yes.